All morning, I'd felt a strange sense of urgency that I could not overcome. It confused my progress at work, where I pride myself on my ability to complete tasks, however monotonous, without distraction. But this morning, the tea on my desk was cold and half drank, yesterday's mail was still unopened, and forms T-812 and R-919D were half filled out, which was a dangerous game, considering any errors in filling out the forms properly could result in an official audit of my entire month's work, or worse, leave a black mark on my record at H.W. Towns Insurance and Associates. Any mistake would certainly need to be accounted for and explained if I were ever to try and make partner at the firm in the future. There were stories of men being passed over for promotion or summarily dismissed for even smaller infractions than a simple blunder on Form T-812 or even a Form R-919D. An old coworker of mine, Terrence something, I can never remember his last name, once stuck a stamp upside down on an envelope. An envelope mailing out Form R-919D, in fact. I was deeply engrossed in my work at the time, but my concentration was broken when he gasped audibly and put his hand over his mouth as he stared at his fatal oversight. Eyes wide, he gave me a desperate look. I had never felt such hopelessness in all my life. I could only stare back at him without a word of encouragement, nor could I offer any possible assistance to correct his irreversible error. After despairingly looking around the room, he brought the envelope to his face, shook his head in defeat, and laid it back down on his desk. He gave me a wan smile, silently rose from his chair, and put on his coat. Terrence puffed out his chest, raised his head, and walked out of the office, like a captured soldier bravely striding to the gallows, chaperoned by the enemy, ready to die with dignity. I never saw him again. Mr. Towns, in fact, sent a letter to Terrence's wife, pleading her to pick up the personal effects that he had left behind. But the letter was returned by the Central Post Office, who notified Mr. Towns that my former coworker's address no longer existed. I found myself standing at the window, staring down on the street below, wondering what happened to my old coworker, who, now that I thought about it, was my first cousin on my mother's side, when the clock chimed, signaling it was 10:30. A sense of implacable dread washed over me. Every morning at 10:30, I had a meeting with the executive board to report on my progress, where I gave detailed updates regarding the status of my accounts. Herr Schoenberg, Mrs. Grand du Soleil, and Mayor Sifkas would all be in attendance. My heart skipped when I realized I was late for the meeting. I could picture them sitting silently around the boardroom table with their hands clasped, nervously flipping through my report from the day before, worried that my accounts were in a critical status and embarrassed for me that I was too ashamed to admit my neglect, while they shared nervous glances but were too anxious to speak to one another for fear that vocalizing their concerns would only drive home the gravity of the problem I created. I scrambled to gather my reports when I looked around the office and realized that I was alone. It then dawned on me that today was Saturday. Herr Schoenberg, Mrs. Grand du Soleil, and Mayor Sifkas were most certainly at home, enjoying a small breakfast with their families, maybe a plain croissant with percolated coffee, or, even better, were out and about, perhaps going for a stroll in the Tiergarten, waving at neighbors and stopping here and there to catch up with acquaintances. Mrs. Grand du Soleil would update Mr. Bauer, the baker, on her daughter's progress at college. Her daughter was studying accounting at the University of Hamburg, and I, in fact, mentored her for a short time at the request of Mrs. Grand du Soleil, which is a source of great pride for me. Mr. Bauer, in turn, would dramatically wipe his forehead, signaling relief after a busy week. I had to suspend all my accounts, he'd say with a relieved sigh, as I prepared a wedding cake that was not 4 but 5 tiers tall to serve all 312 guests at Mr. Kurtz's wedding this evening. Mrs. Grand du Soleil would then dramatically put her hand on her chest and say, 5 tiers? Well, good on you, Mr. Bauer, and congratulations on a job well done. I cannot wait to enjoy the cake with you at Mr. Kurtz's wedding tonight. Vertiginous terror gripped my body and the room spun. I had to steady myself against the window as it dawned on me that I had only come into the office that morning to retrieve Julia's wedding ring from my safe. My wedding was this evening, and here I had wasted the entire morning at my desk. I had even made special arrangements with Mr. Towns so he'd allow me to use the safe, which was specifically reserved for work-related documents only. I patted my breast pocket and was relieved to remember I'd retrieved the ring as soon as I entered the office that morning. I had every intention of turning around and heading out to the formal breakfast my mother had been preparing for our family for weeks in anticipation of the wedding, but I must have been distracted by the pile of work that was on my desk. Filling out 1 or 2 forms T-812 or R-919D certainly wouldn't hurt anyone as long as I leave the instant I lick the envelope, I remembered saying to myself. But I must have become distracted as soon as I sat down to work. I resolved to no longer let work interfere with my personal life. Starting today, work comes second, I said to myself. I realized, however, that there would be times where work would need to come first. Yes, here and there I surely would have late nights, especially when working under a deadline set by Mayor Sivkas, requiring me to work into the early hours of the morning, perhaps even necessitating I sleep at my desk to catch a few hours of rest before my daily meeting with the board at 10:30. But such occurrences would be few and far between. In any event, I would have fair notice that a late night would be in store for me, and I could arrange my social and personal obligations accordingly. So, I suppose, work would still come second. However, conditionally. I sighed with relief and felt a sense of pride that I'd made such an important decision when I stumbled and nearly fell face first on the concrete. I'd become so engrossed in my thoughts that I didn't realize I was already far from the office and on my way to the tram to Mother's house so I could catch the tail end of the breakfast she'd planned. Surely the guests would be angry that I was late to a celebration held in my honor, but I already had a speech prepared to explain my tardiness. I would emphasize to the attendees that I was late, but only on account of my tireless commitment to work that so vitally dictated the daily functions of our town. This would surely impress the guests, and then I'd further dazzle them with my resolution to put my personal and social obligations first, with, of course, a few exceptions that I would plan for accordingly, topmost being an immovable deadline set by Mayor Sivkas. A few small claps would echo from the back of the room before more applause joined in, and soon all the guests would be on their feet, cheering me on, tinkling their forks against their champagne flutes, becoming ever more boisterous until the guests remembered they were at a semi-formal event and would bring the applause to a more respectable intensity. I was so enraptured with my daydream that I hadn't noticed the skies had opened up during my reverie, and I had been caught in the middle of a short but intense sun shower. The clouds had already passed, but my clothes were soaked through. Due to new civic regulations I had fought for tooth and nail at city council meetings, citizens were not allowed on the tram if they were wet. A small comeuppance for not carrying an umbrella after they had fair warning that there was a high chance of precipitation, thanks to the required daily weather updates in our local paper, another initiative spearheaded by yours truly. Now I was paying for my own zealousness and vowed to do what I could to reverse the city council's decision that I myself had fought so hard for. It was clear to me now that forgetting an umbrella was not a matter of irresponsibility. In some cases, no. It's reasonable that a person would become so engrossed in their work or obligations that carrying an umbrella would be a secondary concern. I would need to prepare a speech to present to the city that both expressed my guilt for what was now clearly an unreasonable city ordinance and a persuasive argument for why such an ordinance should be overturned. But that would have to come later, for arriving at the wedding on time was rightfully my number one priority. Not that preparing the speech and overturning the ordinance weren't also important. In fact, it was a close second. I would need to explain to Julia after we exchanged our vows that I would need some time alone during the wedding reception to put some thoughts together, simple bullet points, so I could work on the speech first thing in the morning. But, at the moment, the more pressing issue at hand was changing into new clothes so I could arrive at the breakfast before it ended. I was so worried that I didn't realize a man was standing next to me. He clapped me on the shoulder to get my attention, and I snapped out of my trance. The man was exactly my height and build, but with dark hair and sharp features. His nose came to a point, and he had a pencil-thin mustache that I admit was unsavory and inappropriate. A sense of great distrust twisted in my gut, but he was the only stranger at hand who could help me with my sorry situation. He didn't say a word, but instead flashed a grin at me to let me know that he had a spare change of clothes upstairs that he would happily loan to me on the condition that I had the suit dry cleaned before returning it to him. I realized that I had spent so much time studying his features and worrying about his grotesque mustache that I didn't notice he had already led me to his house, and we were sitting in his living room waiting for a pot of tea to brew. I felt it would be rude to decline his offer to warm up with a cup of tea, especially considering he was about to offer such a tremendous favor. His living room was painted a sickly green, and the walls were lined with shelves containing books that were swollen with humidity, so much so that the words on the pages had been rendered illegible. I anticipated he would offer me to borrow one of his books, in this instance a photo album, meticulously curated by his grandmother on his father's side, but seeing that he was a stranger to me and I was in too much of a hurry to accept his offer, I could decline without hurting his feelings. The tea had finished brewing, and he poured me a cup. He raised a small pitcher of bluish-gray milk and offered to add a splash to my tea. Since I was planning on declining his offer to borrow his grandmother's photo album, I had no choice but to accept a small bit of milk in order to gain a bit of goodwill I could cash in on shortly, even though I'd never put milk in my tea under any circumstance. He gave me a rather forceful nod to suggest I should take a sip, so I did, and I immediately gagged. Ah! The milk was sour and beyond impotable. But I hid my gag with a theatrical cough, suggesting it wasn't the milk that caused my spasm, rather a tickle in my throat. He smiled, revealing a row of teeth that were spaced too far apart, and nodded to excuse himself to finally retrieve his spare suit for me. As he walked up the stairs, I realized that I had been sitting with him for so long that I was now dry. I no longer needed his suit, and his unsettling personality had made me so nervous that I resolved to sneak out the back door as he rummaged upstairs. I quietly set down my saucer and tiptoed into the kitchen when my stomach twisted in a knot. On the kitchen table was a pig, suspended by a canvas strap around its belly that was attached to two poles. It was running on a treadmill and had suction cups attached to its nipples, sucking milk out of its breasts. And the pig looked vaguely familiar. The suction cups were attached to dirty hoses that emptied into a bucket underneath the table containing revolting bluish-gray milk. The pig had a mirror in front of its face tied to a stick, not unlike a carrot to motivate a horse, and it was running tirelessly at its own reflection. Immediately, I did not feel guilty for taking my leave so abruptly. I felt vomit burn in the back of my throat at the thought of the pig's milk stirring in my belly when I heard the perverted stranger's footsteps heading down the stairs. I quickly snuck out the back door. The door emptied me onto a busy street. By now, the sky was getting dark. I would need to hurry to the venue immediately, and certainly no longer had time to spare to change into my tuxedo. No, the suit I was wearing would have to do. Surely the guests would understand that I'd had a very hectic day being pulled in every possible direction, and that it was a marvel I had even arrived in the first place. In fact, my suit would be a shining representation of my devotion to the city, to my work, to strangers and acquaintances, to every guest in attendance, and to my wonderful fiancée, Julia. I wouldn't even need to prepare any words to explain why I wasn't dressed like the rest of the wedding party. I could proudly, but still with a sense of humility, puff my chest, and that would be more than enough reassurance that my priorities were in the right place and that I was a dutiful city servant. I was so wrapped up in my imagination that I didn't notice a car was stopped at the curb, frantically honking its horn. I realized that it was my old college roommate, Cassandra, and that she was right on time to pick me up to take me to the wedding. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as I remembered I had requested her to pick me up at this very spot at this very minute so I wouldn't be late for my wedding. In fact, if we made good time, I would have the wiggle room to change into my tuxedo. But if that were the case, I would need to come up with another bold statement to reassure the guests that I was a dutiful city servant, as I would no longer be wearing a humble suit. Cassandra tapped her fingers nervously on the steering wheel as we headed away from the city. I was so worried about how I'd explain to the guests just hours from now why I was wearing a fancy tuxedo and not my humble suit that I didn't realize we'd been driving for so long. I am so glad you agreed to attend at least one rehearsal before opening night tomorrow, she said with a tone that suggested relief but still contained a strong air of reproach. I put my head in my hands and sighed as I remembered I'd missed every rehearsal for tomorrow night's play that I had so intensely prepared an audition for not 6 months ago. And to make matters worse, I was the star of the show. Sure, I only had one line, but it had to be delivered so perfectly, giving every word space to breathe without belaboring the message, that the entire town decided I should get top billing. The success of the play relied entirely on my one line. I desperately tried to remember what it even was, and before I knew it, my cue was called on stage. I was so wrapped up in trying to remember my line that I didn't realize I was already dressed in costume and waiting in the wings to enter from stage right. It was now or never. I bravely took a step forward and was immediately blinded by the intense stage lights. The auditorium was pin drop silent. The actors on the stage looked at me with excited anticipation, barely managing to remain in character as they anxiously waited for me to deliver my line. I took a deep breath and spoke, using the accent I had so laboriously practiced for months. Frankly, Mrs. Murphy, I must suggest we pause the conversation and depart for breakfast. I let out a quiet sigh of relief while still retaining character, yet no line was delivered in response. My palms began to sweat, and I was sure I had torpedoed the production with my clumsy acting. Kier Dolia, the starring supporting actor, finally addressed the quiet that fell over the auditorium. "Excuse me," he cried out for the entire company to hear, signaling to halt rehearsal while a very serious issue was addressed. My face burned with embarrassed shame. "But I must insist," he continued. "We take a moment to applaud Mr. Kurtz here for his unbelievable performance. This will surely be remembered for days, no, centuries to come, and I pity anyone living or dead who cannot attend tomorrow's performance." Relief swept over me as the cast stood at once to applaud the perfect delivery of my line. The crew came out from the wings and cheered with tears in their eyes. I humbly waved to thank them while maintaining a serious expression to show them there was still work to be done and rehearsal was not yet over. However, people had already begun pouring into the auditorium from the streets, and journalists elbowed their way to the proscenium, insisting that the scene be taken from the top so they could witness my impeccable delivery. The director agreed, knowing that having such a hot scoop for the news would drum up already enthusiastic excitement for tomorrow's show, and he asked if I would take the scene again from the top. I pretended to mull it over, suggesting that the rest of the play was more important than my single line, but this was only to add dramatic effect. And I let my vanity bask in their zeal to see my performance. I humbly nodded and the audience cheered, but they were quickly silenced by the director. I went back into the wings when I realized that the news of my performance would most certainly break early, before the paper was even printed and well before my wedding that evening, and remembered that I was already running late. Julia would be disappointed that I'd taken such a selfish side trip only to stroke my ego, leaving her waiting at the altar, and I didn't realize my cue had already been called. I stumbled onto the stage. At first, the auditorium mistook my pause for an attempt at dramatic emphasis, but soon it was clear I was faltering. I stammered, revealing to all present that I was unprepared and, worse, a deplorable bastion of unprofessionalism. Before the audience could jeer or, worse, call for my immediate dismissal from the play, a trap door that I hadn't noticed before opened only a few feet away. A man's head popped out from underneath the stage, and I realized it was my former coworker and first cousin Terrence, who had dismissed himself from H.W. Towns and Associates so professionally for his irredeemable misplacement of the stamp. I then remembered that this whole stamp scandal was a carefully engineered farce so that Terrence could make himself readily available in the event that I was running late for my wedding based on my history of outrageous distraction. The entire plot was his idea, and at first I declined his offer to sabotage his professional career on my account, but Terrence was notorious for his persistence, and I finally gave in. In any event, a mistake as small as incorrectly placing a stamp on an envelope could be forgiven if he could show to the city, well, especially Mayor Sifkas, that his mistake was contrived. Even though it's no laughing matter, he would devote himself entirely to his work to make up any loss of faith and regain the trust of the city. Many late nights were ahead of him, however, he'd take his probation in stride. I was so relieved that Terrence could reclaim his status in society, not without hard work, of course, that I didn't realize I was already at the church, standing at the altar. Luckily, my costume from rehearsal required me to wear a tuxedo, so it only took a few turns of the winding underground tunnels beneath the city to lead me to the altar, totally prepared for the ceremony. As I waited for the front doors of the church to open so my bride-to-be's father could walk her down the aisle, I checked my watch. Despite all the unbelievable interruptions I had faced that day, I still managed to arrive to the church on time, and safely secured in my breast pocket was Julia's ring. Before I knew it, the national anthem began to play by the chamber quartet I had scheduled to perform at the wedding, at no small expense, mind you, and the front doors of the church opened. At first, I could only see Julia's father. He winked at me proudly, happy to call me his son-in-law by night's end. His pointed pink ears quivered on the side of his head. I held my breath as Julia entered the church. However, my happy anticipation was immediately deflated as I realized I had broken one of the most important rules of one's wedding day, that being that it is considered bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony. My heart sank, and my shoulders sagged noticeably. Murmuring swept among the pews, and I waved for the chamber quartet to stop playing the national anthem. It would be a tremendous inconvenience to all those in attendance, but I had to do the right thing. Friends, families, loved ones, neighbors, the Honorable Mayor Sifkas. I would never forgive myself if I didn't admit I've made a terrible mistake, although by accident, that requires we halt this ceremony immediately. An audible, united gasp erupted from the crowd. For I made the horrible mistake of seeing Julia before today's ceremony. In the front of the church, Julia oinked in agreement. At once, I was relieved that she shared a part of the guilt, even though our seeing one another was entirely an accident. How was I to know that escaping the pencil-mustachioed stranger's living room would lead to me running into Julia in the kitchen? I should have noticed that it was her immediately by the blonde, coarse fur that covered her pink body, not to mention her delicate nipples. And to make matters worse, I had drank of her milk before the ceremonial toast that would follow our first kiss as a married couple, but she was no virgin, I can assure you of that. Nevertheless, I was overwhelmed with a sense of shame for letting the attendees down. Sensing it was her turn to speak, Julia oinked with tremendous eloquence, explaining it was an honest mistake and the ceremony would have to resume tomorrow. This won over the crowd, resulting in applause to show support. However, there were a few important people, Mrs. Grand du Soleil among them, who were still unconvinced. Doubt swept over me, but for a split second, when I realized I had the perfect opportunity to win the entire crowd over. Friends, families, acquaintances, and coworkers. I gave a sly, confident smile and began a speech that would both reassure them and emphasize that I was a dutiful city servant with an unshakable commitment to my fellow man. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, I would like to take this opportunity to admit yet another terrible folly I've made, followed by what you will soon agree is a most convincing argument to overturn the ordinance that I once so fervently fought for. Of course, I am speaking about revoking the law that prevents wet passengers from riding the tram. But first, let me explain to you why I'm wearing a tuxedo and not a humble suit. Everyone in the church leaned forward, excited to hear my argument. I took a deep breath and began to state my case.